This is Gemara Baba Kama Daf Ayin Zayin. We're holding on the last line of Ayin Vav Amid Beis. And as we mentioned at the end of the previous year, Ayin Zayin Amid Aleph is a very short Amid. As one could see, there's a plethora of Taisis over there. So just to remind ourselves, we're in the middle of discussing the Shita of Rav Shimon. As we answered Rav Lazar's kasha, that Rav Lazar was the Shamitze Hadar of Shimon. Rav Lazar forgot, whatever that means, that which Rav Shimon said, which was what? Kol Oime Lizraik is Kizarik Dami, 5 lines from the top, and Kol Oime Liftois is Kipadui Dami. So at the end of the previous year, we proved that Rav Shimon holds Kol Oime Lizraik is Kizarik Dami, that the fact that the carbon is fit for the Zrika, that there was a moment in time before Shkias Achama that the carbon could have been done as Zrika. Therefore, it is Kizarik Dami, and therefore it is going to be Mikabel, therefore it will be Miktame Tomas Eichlin. Now we're on the last line of Ayin Vavam and Beis, which the Gemara says, Chlami Liftois is Kibadui Dami. And where do we see that Rav Lazar, Rav Shimon subscribes to that din? Titania, we learned in Abraisa, Rabbi Shimon Oimer, as we turn over to Ayin Zayin Amid Aleph. Rav Shimon Oimer, Para, Mitama, Thomas Eichlin, Hayel v'Haisala Yishasa Kosher. A para, of course, the top Rashi points out is what type of para is a para aduma, says Rashi, is Mitame Thomas Eichlin. Hayel, what is the reason why a para aduma, after it is shechted, which one is not able to get any hana from such an animal, there is Thomas Eichlin. The reason is Hayel v'Haisala Shasa kosher, since it did have a moment that it was kosher. As Rashi points out, it was kosher lechol to eat misha nishchata v'yardala teiras eichel, and therefore, in as much as the para aduma is not a regular carbon that is shechted in the chatzer, in the azara, and there is no kedushas haguf. However, the para aduma does have kedushas damim, because of course para aduma belongs to Gans Klal Yisrael. It was bought with the monies of all of Klal Yisrael from the Chumas Alishka, and therefore that is the reason why the para aduma, one cannot get any benefit from it. And therefore, says the Gemara, because there was a moment of time after the shechita that it was be'etzem, theoretically mutter ba'achila, therefore it gets the din of being eichlin, and therefore, even though a moment later, when it becomes a para aduma, it's no longer allowed to be in, but there it would still be mitame Thomas eichlin. We move over to Ayin Zayin Amid Beis, in which the Gemara says, "V'amar Reish Lakish," and teaches Reish Lakish, "Aimer Hayer Rav Shimon." Rav Shimon would say the following: "Aimer Hayer Rav Shimon, para nifteis al gabe marachasa." A para aduma can be redeemed when after the shechita upon the maracha, which was the wooden area on which it was shechted. And therefore, because it could have been redeemed at that moment that it was mutter ba'achila, alma kolemi liftois is kipadoi dami. Since it had that moment of time, it could have been redeemed, even though it was not redeemed, and even though because it was not redeemed, it is aser bahana. Still, kolemi liftois is kipadoi dami. And therefore, just going full circle for a moment, if we're discussing a case of a ganov who stole a behema that was not a tamimim, rather it was a balmum, and it was outside of the azara, the halacha is going to be, according to this, he has to pay dalid v'hei, because even though the moment of the shechita does not make the animal permitted to be eaten, why? Because it still needs to be redeemed. because again, it's a carbon with a mum, and therefore it has to be redeemed in order to be eaten. But since there was this shasa kosher, since there was this moment of time that it could have been redeemed, according to Rav Shimon, kol aimer liftais is kepadoi dami. So says the Gemara, if we remind ourselves, this brought us really back to Machlekes Rav Yechon and Reish Lakish in understanding Rav Shimon's halacha, in which there will be the payment of Dalad Vehe. So bez the Gemara, why doesn't Rav Yechon hold of Reish Lakish? Why doesn't Reish Lakish hold of Rav Yechon? So bez Lama Rav Yechon Reish Lakish, 4 lines down, Ein Zayin and Bez the Gabayla Ukman Lemas Nisan. I feel it to me, because Rav Yechon preferred to understand that the Mishnah could even be talking about Tamimim, even be talking about an animal that does not have a mum. When you look at Rashi, Rashi points out, and certainly if it had a mum, why? Because to understand the case of an animal that we're only discussing a case of a Balmum, says Reish Lakish, says Rav Yechon, excuse me, that is a dachik way of learning. It's forced pshat. El Reish Lakish, my time Lamar Rav Yechon. Says the Gemara, okay, so why doesn't Reish Lakish though hold the Rav Yechon? Amr Lacha, Reish Lakish responds, it says in the Torah, V'tavchai umachrai, or ay umachrai. It was slaughtered or it was sold, shows that the two are comparable. Kol echad isa b'machira, isa b'tvicha. Kol echad lesa b'machira, lesa b'tvicha. And therefore, says Reish Lakish, the two have to be similar, and therefore, v'hani kachim, hayel dechi mazvin, kachim loy have b'machira. Since these kachim of the tamimim, it is not considered a machira if they are sold. Therefore, les nayu b'tvicha. Therefore, the din of tvicha will not apply to them either. So, for a moment, let's again look at Rashi on the second narrow line. Lahavi machira. Why? De'ein kachim tamimim yaitze lechulin. Because an animal which is a tam, an animal without a mum, does not go lechulin if you try to sell it holkach. And that's the reason why Reish Lakish said we must not be talking about Tamimim, but rather we must be talking about a Balmum. And says the Gemara, that in reality this machlekes, this debate, Reish Lakish Rav Yechanan, is l'shitasai. 12 lines down, the first one line is de'itmar. Explains the Gemara, Hamaicher treifa l'divri Rav Shimon. If someone sells a treifa, what is Allah according to Rav Shimon? Rav Yechon Amar Chayiv, Reish Lakish Amar Pater. Rav Yechon will say you're Chayiv Dalad Vehei. Reish Lakish says you're Pater Dalad Vehei. Explains the Gemara. Rav Yechon Amar Chayiv, why Avagav de Lese B'Tvicha Isei B'Mechira. Rav Yechon doesn't mind that the halachas of Tvicha and Mechira line up per se, and therefore says Rav Yechon, even though there is no din of Tvicha, because the animal is a treifa, there's still din of mechira, and therefore you'd be chayv dal vehi on the mechira, says Rabbi Yechon. Reish Lakish Amar, no, Pater, keeping the less of tvicha, less of mechira, and with that the Gemara proves that that's the same machlekes Rabbi Yechon and Reish Lakish that we just explained. So continues the Gemara, Eisvei, Rabbi Yechon and Reish Lakish. So now that we understand each shita, let's ask some kashas, 15 lines down. The first one in line is Rav Shimon ben Lakish. Says in the Braisa, Ganav Kalayim, Ganav Kalayim Utvacha, if someone steals Kalayim, Vitavcha, and they slaughter such an animal, Umachra, or sell it, what's the halacha? Meshalim Tashlumi Dalad Vehei. Says the Gemara, my love, is this not going according to the opinion of Rav Shimon? He says, Rav Yechon. And Alma approves Rav Yechon and asks his kasha and Reish Lakish, Aval Gav the Lesa b'Tvicha Isa b'Mechira. Even though, of course, there's no din of Tvicha. Why is there no din of Tvicha? Because it's an animal of Kalayim. Still, says Rav Yechon, you see this Braisa, there's a din of Mechira. Amar Le responds Rish Lakish Loi. Rabbanan, this is the opinion of the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan who hold that a treifa is indeed within the halachas of shchita. However, according to Rav Shimon, that holds that a treifa is not royal shchita, Eina Chanami, says Rish Lakish, we're not of a din of mechira as well. Rabbanan asked the Gemara, treifa mechira isa vizvicha lesa. I don't understand. Just like according to the Rabbanan, there would be a din of tvicha on a treifa. Says the Gemara, there should also be a din of, if according to the Rabbanan, that there would be a din of Dalet V'Hei for the Mechira, asks the Gemara, then there should be a din of Tvicha as well. It responds, the Gemara responds, Rish Lakish Velamai. So what are you going to tell me, Rav Shimon? You tell me it's the opinion of Rav Shimon. Klayim B'Tvicha Isa, B'Mechira Lesa. So we're going to have a similar kasha that what the Brisa says is Dalet V'Hei in the case of the Tvicha. If you shecht the Klayim, so that says the Gemara would only be by Tvicha, not by Mechira. Ella, rather, what must we say? Tana Tvicha Vu'adin Mechira. We have to say that in this Brisa, it's Lavdafka. And it's true, the Brisa spoke about a case of Tvicha, but the Brisa is referring to a case of Mechira as well. So, Eimal Rabbanan, Anami, Tana Mechira Vu'adin Tvicha. Therefore, there won't be any kasha on Rav Yochanan. There won't be a kasha. There won't be a kasha on Rish Lakish, because we're going to have to explain this Brisa must be referring to everyone. Rav Yochanan Amar Lacham, and the Gemara concludes, it says, what about according to Rav Yochanan? Hi, Mai. If you're going to tell me that the Brisa is Rav Shimon, I did it on a treifa bechada. Tari kalayim bechada. Since it spoke about the case of treifa in one case, it speaks about the case of kalayim in one case as well. Eliyamir Rabbanan, but if you're going to tell me that the Brisa is the opinion of the Rabbanan, who say that Dalet V'Hei only applies, Dalet V'Hei, yes, applies both to the Tvicha of the Kalayim or Treifa, Narachinu v'Nasninu, it should have mixed them together and read it. This is more like a, as the Gemara always says, that Tana b'may Peligi, and the Gemara always says that, as we find often, that will say in Mishnais, Neflignu v'Nasninu badidei. Since the similar lashon, Narechinu v'Nasninu, we should have mixed them together and taught that what? Kanav kalayim treifa, tavchanu machar mishal t'shum Dalet V'Hei. We should have listed it all together. Says the Gemara, it's true, kasha, that Rav Yochanan does end with a kasha on Rish Lakish. And that's really where the Gemara concludes. But says the Gemara, let's go 1 second back into the Brisa we just said. It's sort of like a gufa. Kalayim, says the Gemara, 2 lines from the white lines. The Brisa says with regard to Kalayim, if it's stolen and then shechted, there's a Dalet V'Hei. Sex, if the pasuk says, with regard to Dalet V'Hei, says, V'yamai Rava, Zeh Banav, this teaches us, Kol Makom Shenemar Seh Einoi Ella, Lo'hoitzi Asai Kalayim. So says Rav, I don't understand. By the virtue of the fact that the Torah says Seh, comes to exclude Kalayim. So how can you tell me that there is a payment of Dalet V'Hei by Kalayim? Explains the Gemara, Shaini Acha, our case is different on the first white line. Why is it different? Damar Kra, Oi, the Rabbi says Kalayim. Ask the Gemara, really? V'choloi the Rabbi Su. V'atani learned in the Brisa, Sharai Kesev. Says in the Brisa, Naksar Alem, Parat L'Klayim, which comes to exclude Klayim. Oyes, Parat L'Nidmeh, comes to exclude Nidmeh, an animal that's born. The animal is born, a mutant animal. It has figures of one and the other. So answers the Gemara, Amar Rava Hacha Me'inyana Dikra, Hacha Me'inyana Dikra. Says Rava, you're right. Not every oy teaches the same thing. It has to do with context. Hachanami Geneva Dechsev, Hachanami Hacha Gabe, Geneva Dechsev Shar Oiseh. By Geneva that it says Shar Oiseh, we learn now Shiati Achaloiti Kalayim, which are 2 items which cannot create Kalayim Ashar Oiseh. mi beinehem, from amongst them. Therefore, oy l'Rabbi Kalayim comes to include Kalayim. Gabe kashen nechsev kesef ve'ez shati achaloiti Kalayim. That you could put together a lamb and a goat. Shati achaloiti Kalayim mibinehem. Oy is going to come, lemai is going to come to exclude. Stop over here and we'll pick it up from Ayin Chesam and Aleph B'siyata Dishmaya.